Hey, Bobby here with Coder Foundry. Over the last several years, we've been teaching Microsoft Blazor in our cohorts. We've also been using Blazor on some of our consulting projects as well. And people are drawn to the render modes of Blazor, meaning that you can take a component and you can run it inside of WebAssembly on the client side, or you can run it on the server side. And there's also interactive server. You can even set it to run auto and let the application figure out where best to run the component itself. And a lot of people are drawn to this, and they should be. It's very cool. It's very powerful. But what's overlooked the most, and I don't think it's talked about a lot, is that Microsoft Blazor is a component-first framework, and building components is an easy process, but it's also very rich and powerful. So today I thought we would talk about building components inside of Blazor. Let's talk about all the common component types that exist out of the box, and let's break into the code, crack open Visual Studio, and build our own component so you can see how all of this works. And then I'll give you a repo so that you can explore it further. So let's talk about Microsoft's component framework, Blazor. So let's talk a little bit more about components. So Blazor is, like I said, a component-first framework, and everything you build inside of a Blazor application is a component. And components are clean and easy to build, and components can execute server-side or client-side, and that's the main draw for Blazor is how to build these server-side components, but they also execute on a client, and it's very powerful, and it's the reason a lot of people come from Blazor. But I think you're going to stick around because of the authoring componentry as well. Now, components are reusable UI building blocks, typically. Some of them are non-visual, but for the most part, when we talk about building components, we're building things that we're going to reuse from page to page, or we want to encapsulate some kind of complex logic to keep our pages nice and tidy. And they include HTML markup, they include CSS, they typically include some C# code, and they can also include isolated JS code. The CSS can also be isolated, meaning that if you write a style inside of a component, it cannot impact other components on its parent, or other CSS in its parent. And Blazor has 5 main types of components. The first one is the app component, and this contains the base HTML and the body tag for the entire site. We also have a router component, and this interprets the route for web apps. So if you type in a URL to a particular page, this router component will go display the correct component. And then there's a layout component. It allows you to build things like nav bars and footer elements, things that you want to appear on this multiple times on different pages, but you only want to change it in one space. And then there's a page component, and that declares a route that the app can respond to, or the router can respond to, so that it can display it. And finally, the 5th one is the UI component. Now, Coder Foundry coined this term here, but these are custom components or building blocks that you build that you want to encapsulate some UI or some logic and then use them in multiple places. A lot of times you may only use it in one spot, but you don't want to put a lot of code inside of your page component. So you kind of take that out, put it inside the UI component to keep the page nice and tidy. The app component is the root component, and every Blazor application has to have one. And it acts as the entry point for the application. And you define this in app.razor. And app.razor is a file when you start up or come from the templates inside of Visual Studio, you'll see this file get created. And it must be there for this to work. Now note, WebAssembly has a special div tag in the index.html, and this is where the app.razor is injected into. And so you can't delete that div tag either if you're running pure WebAssembly. And if you're running an auto mode, you also need to leave it alone as well. So the app component also contains the router component, and this interprets the browser's URL and allows us to display the correct page. The layout component is a place for global elements like we discussed, like headers and footers. Typically, you want to change your header in one spot, and you want to inject that on every single page. And that's what the layout component does. It sets the overall structure for the app, and the layout component must inherit from layout component base. Now, what's great about the layout component is it also contains HTML, CSS, and C# code and JavaScript code. So if your navbar of your header is complex or you need to change things on some kind of use case, you can write code inside the layout component and they can be pretty complex. Or you can just have plain HTML and CSS, inject that around as you want on your whole app, and it'll just work. Again, you'll have an inherits tag, layout component base, and this is what makes a layout component a layout component. Now, the page component is the one that you'll probably deal with the most. And it's a special type of Razor component that we can create, and it represents navigatable pages in an application. And it's integral to Blazor's routing system. So if you do not have a route, an app page directive at the top of your page, it's not a page. And this is how it works. So it defines the URL for the component. For example, you're going to have a page directive and then a string that tells it what the route is for this component. That also can be the name of the page. It can be a folder plus another name. Plus, it can also have like attributes if you want to pass an attribute in, or tell the page this route is expecting these parameters. And we'll talk about that when we build our own UI components. And page components can use common layouts. And so when we have our layout component, we can have one layout component for the entire app, or the page could have its own layout. And each individual page can have its own layout, but it can take advantage of that one layout component so you don't have to worry about building the header and footer on each page. And this ensures a consistent appearance across your whole application. Now, the final type of component is the UI component, and this is a term coined by us here at Foundry. And let's talk about what a UI component is. Well, it's really they're components that are not routable. They don't have that page directive. They don't inherit from layout component base. Basically, they're used as reusable building blocks on pages. And you can build it once and use many times. However, sometimes you just want to encapsulate some code in a component so that your page doesn't become overly complicated. And you may build it once and only use it once, but that's to take the complexity out of the page, stick it inside the component, and therefore it's easier to build, easier to maintain, and people can work on the component and not necessarily work on the page. You can have separate logic and markup from the page, which is great. It has its own isolated CSS, its own isolated C# code, and its own isolated JS code. So you can separate that entirely from the page. The page doesn't have to know anything about how the component displays itself, and then you just drop it on the page and then it just works. All right, let's talk about a UI component architecture, and that's what we're going to build today. Basically, we have data in, and then you modify the data in the component, and then you have data out. The one thing that we don't recommend in most cases is that you do not want to have database access inside the component. Basically, the component should receive data from the page or the parent, and then modify that and then send it back out. And then the parent decides what to do with it. So the page will perform the data access, not the component. Now, we could break this rule in some cases, but in the hopes that if you have a component that's sometimes built out in a loop, or maybe you're making a line item like we'll do, you make a line item component, you don't want that component to open up a database connection every single time it's rendered. You want to kind of work on a collection of items or a list of items, modify that and send it out, or work on an individual object, modify that and send it back out, and let the page figure out what to do with the database or the API endpoint that it's accessing. The component doesn't need to know about how it's going to be updated or where the data comes from. You just pass it in, modify it, change it, do whatever you want to do, and pass it back out. And we think that's a really good architecture or plan to follow, and you have to have a really good reason to do it otherwise. However, it's flexible. You can do whatever you want inside of this component. But this is what we try to say, we'll follow this plan until we can't. All right, so let's break into Visual Studio and let's write some code. Okay, before we crack into Visual Studio, let's look at what we're going to build and what our final solution should look like. So this is going to be a simple to-do list. And I know you've seen a lot of them, but I don't want to focus on the app so much as building out the component is really what we want to learn about today. So let's say that I have this tasker and I want to create a list of how to live longer. So I could do something like eat less, sleep more, work out, live longer. All right, so that's my 4-step plan to live longer. I don't know if that will get me on Oprah per se, but you know, it is still pretty good advice. And you can see here, we can click this box here and it says, okay, I'm eating less now. I'm sleeping more, but I haven't started working out yet, so I'm not going to live longer yet. Also can just delete these as well. So I can delete any item I want out of here. So this is our component. And what we want to do is write an app that renders this out as a component. So let's break into VS or Visual Studio and see how that could work. All right. So currently right now, this is a sample program that we've built out, and you'll get a link to this in the description so you can get this whole repo here. And this is a Blazor WASM project. So to run completely by client side, no server side rendering. And we want to make this as simple as possible and just focus in on component building. Now, one thing that you do need to understand is we do have a service layer here that's getting our items out of local storage. The reason we wrote a service for this is because the service could be a database, could be an endpoint. We're using local storage. And what we want to show you is that the component is unaware of how these items get saved. We're just passing in an item, and it's going to pass back an item that could be modified or deleted. And this page will render it. We also keep our pages pretty simple by using a service layer for all database interactions or backend interactions. So our service is over here in the services folder here, and you can see we have an interface here. Our interface describes like what the methods are. We have a get, we have a save, we had an add, and we have a remove. And then we have an implementation right here. And this is where you'll see code in here. If we do an add here, for example, we're calling adding to the list. And then we have a save. We're also saving that to local storage here. And so this is also a good example of JavaScript interrupt as well. So if you get this, you can look through how we did this. But this code could have been database interaction. It could be called an endpoint, an API or whatever. So it doesn't really matter what this is because our components can be disconnected from that. All right, so let's get back to our page here. So I'm back on my page and I've already got these methods written out. And the first method that runs on initialize here is it calls our service layer and gets a list of items in local storage if there are any. Okay. This variable here is task list is defined right here. And this is a list or a collection of tasker items. And this is the type we're going after. And so if you look in our model here, tasker item has 3 properties. It has a GUID, or the ID of GUID stands for globally unique identifier. It's just a long string. And then we have this name. This is our display name where, it says eat less, sleep more. And then we also have this Boolean is complete. And this was control that strike through. When you see it, we click on it and the strike through changes. This GUID will use this ID to find which item we want to delete. So that's our entire model here. And this is a type inside of C#. And so we get a list of these, which means more than one, a list of these items right here. And so we pass this list into this for each loop. And so right here, you can see it's looping over them, and each line item here in this task list is one task, okay? And so then we display each task in a div. So if we run this, we'll show you what it looks like right now. This is our sample app before we use components. See here, it's got our eat less, our sleep more, and this came out of our local storage. All right, and this is where this is happening. So this div statement right here displays these names. And so what I want to do is I want to replace this line, this HTML here, with a component. Now, to be fair, we could write all of this in the page and we don't have to use components at all. But a lot of times we want to put the complexity of what this is, a lot of HTML, a lot of markup, maybe some CSS, maybe even some logic. And we don't need to put that all on our page. And we can encapsulate that into a component and makes our pages clean, neat, and tidy. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. Components are also reusable. So if you had to display this somewhere else, you have a control that use lots in an app, it makes it reusable and portable around the project. The other thing is that while this could have been done on the page, typically pages are more complicated than this Tasker app. And so you may have multiple controls on here and multiple areas that need to be in components. And if you didn't put in components, it makes this page extremely complex, hard to navigate, hard to change, and hard to work on. And so components allows you to focus in on like one thing, pass some data in, modify it, pass it out. Okay. So let's make our first component here. I'm going to stop it from running. And let's maximize Visual Studio. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a component. And we look at our structure here. If you run a web app from default or a Blazor app, the structure that comes directly from Microsoft is a little bit different. Here at Coder Foundry, we create a component folder. And we put our layout and our pages inside of this folder. And then when we have UI components, like I'm getting ready to do, we create another folder called UI. And then in here, we put all of our UI components. So I'm going to add a new component here, Razor component. And I'm going to call it Tasker line. Now, the other thing that I need to do we like to do, we have this imports here. And what imports does is control what's visible globally in the project. And we're going to make these UI components globally visible in our project. So we don't have to put a using statement whenever we're using them. These will all be brought in for us. So I'm going to add that real quick. All right. So now any UI components I put in here will be visible globally in the project. And that's kind of what we want because we'll use these on multiple pages typically. All right. Close that down. Get rid of that. All right. So let's go back to our component here. And you can see our component is just HTML and a code block. And the first thing I want to do is to get an item, a name inside of this. And then we'll come back and we'll add, delete, and then we'll add the complete functionality. So in order for me to pass in something into my component, I need to have a parameter. And so we can mark it up like this. So I'm going to say parameter. And then I just give it a name of the parameter. I type in a name. So I'm going to say public Tasker item. And I'm going to call it item. And then that's just going to be getter setter. All right. So this is a parameter of the type item here. And this just says this could be null. All right. Now we're going to handle this here in a second here. So what I want to do is display this in my component. So the first thing that I want to do, I think is a good practice, is I'm going to check to see if this item is null. It shouldn't be, but I'm going to check it anyway. And if it's not null, I'm going to display. Otherwise, this component's not going to render. Okay, so this is what this check is doing. So if it's not null, and we'll need to put our little C# feather there. And so let's start writing our div here. So I'm going to write a div. And I typically encapsulate all of my layout in a div when this happens, because I want to make sure that this can just be plugged in anywhere. So I have to be aware a little bit of what the parent is, but you can make sure you encapsulate it in your own containers to make sure that your component always displays correctly. All right, so I'm going to create a little flex box here. And this is Bootstrap. It's not entirely important. So you could be using Tailwind. You could use rows and columns for Bootstrap. You can use any CSS you want to style it. I'm going to use Bootstrap here. And all I'm going to do is make this a row. And it's going to have 3 columns in it eventually. One for the checkbox, one for my name, and one for my little trash can icon. And I'm going to make sure they're aligned in the center. So inside this box here, I'm going to get a div in here. Okay. And Now I want to display inside that div this item, which is this parameter being pushed in. And remember, this is a type, and the property from this type I want to show is name. Right? Pretty easy. Okay. Pretty simple. That's what we'll do first. Can we just display the name as the user's entered it? Okay. So this is my component. Let's go back to our page here and let's start using it. So let's replace this line of code with our component. So I should be able to see it. There it is. Tasker line. All right. Let's get rid of that. I'll get rid of this so we can show you kind of what's going on here. All right, so now I have my tasker line component. And what I need to do is pass this value line item. And if I hit the space bar here, you can see it has a parameter called item. And I could do this. And I would just say line item. Okay, so this is the parameter name. And this is the value being passed in that parameter. But let's take this out. I want to show you one other thing about components that you can do, because this should be required. If you want to display a tasker line, I need a tasker line. I need a tasker item in it, and it should be required. So let's make it required. So I'm going to come over here to this parameter here. I'm going to add another attribute here, and it's going to be called editor required. I'm going to show you what happens when we add this to our parameter declaration. I'll save that. Let's rebuild it. And so now this has got some, we call this green ramen affectionately encoded Foundry, but it's an underline. It's telling us it has an issue here. It says tasker line expects a value for the parameter item, but it may not have been provided. So this is giving you a warning that, hey, this is expecting it. You haven't given it to me yet. So let's go ahead and give it to it. And let's pick the parameter name and then give it our value. So typically, if you want this to be required, you mark it up inside your component as editor required. You may have to build it if you do it second time around, but that's okay. All right, so let's run this now and see if our component behaves just like the other code that we had originally. Go to Tasker here. And you can see it's the same result. All right, and if I add another one, let's see, eat less, work out. Still works the same. And now we've replaced that HTML that was in the page with our component. So now let's add a delete functionality over here. So I'm going to go over here to tasker line. And what I want to do is add in another column here, another div. And this is going to have an icon and a button. The first thing I'm going to do is add a button. And this is what the user will click on to get to delete the item. And let's style it up. And this is just Bootstrap styling. So I'm going to say B10. And one of the stylings inside of for a button is you can style it as a link. And then inside this button for the button face, I want an icon. And this is Bootstrap icons. So this is just BI dash trash. Fill. And then we'll give it a color. And the color for red is danger inside of Bootstrap. All right, pretty nifty. So what I want this to do is when I click this, I need to invoke a function in the parent page to actually do the deletion, okay? And so what I can do is create another parameter, and this is a parameter, and this is going to be a callback, okay? And we're also going to make this editor required, and we'll say public event callback. All right, and if we pass this a type, it will be passed back. So we want to pass back the GUID or the unique ID of the item that the user selected. So each individual instance of this component will have a unique identifier, and we're going to pass that back and then delete that one. Now, one of the things that we do is we need to give this a name. And so we have a naming convention here, and we say the word on, and then the function, and then we call callback. So this could be on delete callback. It could be on change callback, whatever, but this is the pattern we follow here. And it works pretty well for us. But you can name this whatever you want. So I have a public event callback, and I've got a GUID as the parameter. So when this gets invoked, the GUID will be passed back to the parent. All right. Now, what I need to do is wire this button up to make sure that this can be invoked. So what we do is we come in here, we're going to add on click. And we're going to say handle delete. Show you the pattern that we use here. And it's going to be giving me a red underline and hey, this does not exist. And so I'm going to write a local function or a local method, and I'm going to make it private. So this isn't seen outside. It's only visible inside this component. And I'm going to say async task handle delete. And then this will invoke this callback here and pass the parameter that we want. So I'm going to say if item, we'll just check to make sure it's not null. This is a good practice to do to make sure that our item isn't null. We'll say await on delete callback. So now we're invoking this method here. We'll say invoke async. And what do I want to pass it? I want to pass it the item.id. So remember, our type has three properties, and one of them's ID, one of them's name, and the other one is complete. And so this will invoke a callback here and invokes this method here. Now you probably wonder, why don't we just call this directly? We could, but it makes this a little bit more complex to write up here. So we like making it simple up here and put the complexity in here for our callback. It's just a pattern we follow. But if you want to write passing parameters up here with arrow functions, you can. But we like doing it this way because it makes it simpler in the UI. And what I like to really do inside my Razor UIs is make these as simple and as close to HTML as possible so that it's simpler to look at the UI and change. In case you have a designer come in and wants to work on stuff, they can get a handle of it. There's a lot of code in here. It makes it harder to change, right? So one other change I want to make here in my UI while we're at it is let's make this item take up as much space as possible. So I'm going to add some padding around it, left and right. And this will be a PX is left and right. And I'm going to say flex grow 1. And what this will do is make the name take as much space. And in this case, it'll push this button all the way to the right. Now, other things that we can do here that I think is kind of something notable to point out is that these components right here can have their own style sheets. We call these isolated style sheets. So let's make a style sheet to style this icon here. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to say add new item. And I'm going to pick style sheet. And there's a naming convention for this inside of Blazor, and we name it after the component. So we say tasker line, that's the name of the component, .razor.css. And you'll know you've done it correctly if it's tacked in under here, right? And so now what's great about these inline style sheets is that they only impact the component they're on. They can't override styles exterior to it. They're isolated to the component. And so let's write a quick style here. And it works like any other style sheet. So we'll say trash icon. We got class selector. And I'm just going to hit the font size. And that's it. We'll save it. And then I'll come here. And now that I have that style, I can just add it to my icon here, trash icon. And it works just like any other CSS. You got to spell it right, lowercase trash icon. Save it. And let's run it and see if this will run. Now, the one other change before we do that, the one other change we got to make, let's go back over here. And now this is giving us green ROM and it's saying, hey, you know what? Expects the on delete callback. So let's make sure we write that to make sure that we can invoke the method that we want. And so what we do is we say on delete callback, and we need to give it a method in this page for it to call when this is invoked. If we scroll down through our code here, you can see we have an update item, and look at that, we have a delete item. So I'm going to give it the name of the function to call, delete item. And of note that the parameter doesn't have to be defined here, just the name of the function that's going to be called. And when that's invoked, this component will satisfy this parameter in this function here and pass it in there. And so the GUI will get passed in from our component into our page, and that's wired up for us automatically. That's one of the kind of the nice things about doing this. Okay, so let's stop this. Sometimes hot reload won't work, so we won't waste time with that. So now we have tasker line, we've got passing in the item, and now we're going to call a function coming back out. So I should be able to delete one. Sure enough, it's gone. Now what happened here, which is pretty interesting, is that when we call delete, this task list gets a new list of items after it's removed. And if you notice, it updates the UI automatically, and we don't have to wire this up. And this is one of the really nice things about Blazor, is that this task list, this variable list of items, these things are bound together. And so whenever they change anywhere in this code, it's going to re-execute this for each loop and change what's on the screen, rebind it. Watch this, it just changes. Okay, it's gone. Kind of nifty. So we can say sleep more. And I'll say exercise, just to show you that these aren't like hard-coded or anything like that. We got 3 items in there, and now our delete is working. All right, so the last thing we can do is we can add a checkbox here. So we can add a checkbox to our service. So I'll stop this. And so I'm going to come back to my component here, and let's work on our UI here. So I'm in my component. I'm going to add another div here in the front here. So now I have 3 columns. And inside of here, I'm going to use a special component. That's not what we want. And so what we want here is we're going to use a Blazor component. We're going to say input checkbox. And this is a special component. And then we can bind the value to item.isComplete. So that means when this value comes in, this is true or false. And since this checkbox works that way, it'll either check or uncheck based on this value. Now, the other thing is when the user clicks it, they're also changing the value. And when the user clicks it, we want to change the style of it and then also mark it in the database as, or in the local storage as complete. So we need to have another type of method that could run here, or another event. And so we're going to say bind value, and then we're going to say after. So after the value is happening, we're going to call a function. We're going to call our same name convention here. We're going to say handle complete. And then let's write a private handle complete down here. I'm going to say private async task handle complete. Notice the naming convention here. It makes it real easy when you have a naming convention that you can do it. Now, this just filled this in for me, but we're not going to use this. So what we need here is when this happens, we need another parameter that sends back. So when we change this, we're actually changing the item and we want to update the entire item. So we're going to pass the item back out when this is checked. So I'm going to write another parameter here. And we'll say public event callback. And we'll say on complete callback. But we'll do this to change, make it a little bit more generic. I think that makes more sense. Completes the name of our property, and what we're really doing is our event here on change. So we're not on complete, we're on change, okay? But we're passing back the entire tasker item back. So now we want to invoke this. And so we'll say await, and then we'll say on change callback, and then we'll pass the item to it. Okay, so remember this item is coming in. If we click on the box here, it's being changed. And let's make sure that we spelled this right. This should be handle complete. Did we spell it right? Oh, beauty. Told us that it wasn't spelled there, and it wasn't. So now it's handle complete, and now that's good because everything's right in the world. Now, the other thing that we need to do is when this is clicked, I want to strike through this item. And so we can do that with CSS. So based on this value, I want to show you another trick that we do quite a bit. It's conditionally add or remove a style. So inside this class here, I can write C# code. And so I've got a little C# line here, and I'm going to say item dot complete. And then I'm going to use something called a ternary operator. And this basically is checking for true or false. If it's true, I want you to add the class complete. Else, I don't want to add anything. So this will, if this evaluates to true, which means checked, it's complete, add in the style complete. If this is unchecked, just add empty. Don't add anything to this class attribute here. So we're conditionally adding a style based on our data. I think that's pretty powerful. So let's add our style sheet here. And let's add one more style here, and we'll say dot complete. And it's just a simple text decoration. And we'll say line 3. Simple, simple. And now what we do is come back to our page here. And let's make sure that this is added. So we'll say on change callback. And we want to call her up. So we got to find what that was called. Probably update item. There it is. Update item. And it'll save it. Whatever we sent back. So we'll just call this update item. Boom. So now we have our 3 parameters. And so if we run this, we should have a working component. And look at that. Marks it out. Marks the second one out. And if we refresh it, this will go back to local storage. And we'll see if it's being saved or persisted there. Should come back marked in. And sure enough, it does. So that's components. And what next? What can we do with this? Well, you can definitely go back and look at this app, go download the code and look at it. And it's not to be dismissed, but if you want to learn the code, want to learn more about Blazor, we've been teaching this for several years now, and our students have great success. So if you want to learn to code, apply to Coder Foundry. Come over to coderfoundry.com, check us out, and maybe we have a course, or maybe the cohort is good for you. We have them starting 4 times a year. So whenever you're watching this, one is starting pretty soon. But anyway, I hope this helps. Good luck and keep coding.